First off, I'd like to welcome everybody. My name is Bob Mueller. You may know me from the County Office of Education, where I've worked for the last 10 years. My role there now has been for the last 17 months, all COVID, all the time. So as a part of that, on the weekly telebriefing with the County of San Diego, we've received tons of questions about ventilation and how to optimize ventilation to make the air in the room safer. In an effort to give you the best information possible, I've contacted LifeWings Peak Performance and KFI to work with us. They're actually performing assessments in 4 of our county schools to give us a sense in the next webinar. They'll be walking through what we've learned through that assessment process and kind of sharing the process, what you can expect if you do an assessment, the kinds of results that you'll get back. So today they're here with us to provide an overview. I'd like to introduce Richard Doss, Senior Vice President for LifeWings Peak Performance, and then he will introduce the other presenters. I'm sorry, and I've jumped the gun. While you can come off mute, I would ask you to keep yourselves muted during the presentation. I'll be monitoring the chat for questions and giving them to the presenters. And then if we have time, we may invite some live questions as well. Thank you. Go ahead, Richard, take it away.
Thank you, Bob. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. I want to welcome everyone this morning. I want to thank especially everyone, all the superintendents and board people and school facilities and principals, everyone that's been very supportive of us on this pilot process. More importantly, everyone carving time out of their busy days to join us today. We know a lot of districts are starting in middle of kindergarten roundups and other exciting things and very busy time of the year. So we'll try and get to the Q&A and the meat of the program here immediately. My name is, as Bob said, is Richard Doss. I'm a Senior Vice President with LifeWings. Today we have Dr. Scott Altman with us, Randy Christensen, and for our Q&A panel today, Liz Bystad from Hamule Schools is going to join us, and she's been very gracious to give us facilities to work in and also be part of the pilot program. So just real quickly, what we're going to cover today, we're going to talk a little bit about the SARS-CoV-2 virus and its spread, also some very clear tactics and tools, the way that we can improve indoor air quality. And of course, as part of the pilot process, we're actually at 4 schools, as Bob said, and so we're beginning to get a little more familiar with some of the specific challenges to San Diego County and a multitude of districts and different demographic populations. We'll also talk a little bit about monitoring and what we call defense in depth. And then one of the reasons we're here today is to talk a little bit about the California Assembly Bill 841 and also some of the ESSER 123 funding, some of the strategies that different districts have been putting in place. So I just want to introduce our 2 main speakers. Dr. Scott Altman is with us. Scott is an emergency physician by training, but right now currently leads the COVID strike team at Advocate Christ Hospital in Chicago and tags along the country with me and in the safer air world for the rest of his job. But he was on faculty at both Johns Hopkins and Northwestern, has done international medical consulting around the world in a number of countries. Also, today we have Randy Christensen. Randy is a environmental and a professional engineer and registered in, as you can see, all 50 states. Randy's personally led over 210, probably 220 or 30 now, COVID HVAC assessments. KFI Engineers has offices in Arizona, in Ohio, Iowa, Minnesota, and the Dakotas. Very involved with schools, very involved with counties and corrections, and we've been working with them now for a good long time on this whole COVID safer air process. And so Dr. Altman will get us started today talking a little bit about airborne respiratory viruses.
Thank you, Bob, for the warm welcome, and Richard for the introduction. As Richard said, I've been working on the COVID strike team since it was started in March of last year. I got COVID in April at the hospital and don't recommend it to anyone who hasn't had it. And so as we see a resurgence, it's an important conversation for us to have. SARS-CoV-2 is out and about. The Delta variant and now the Delta Plus variant are certainly causing concern, as we'll see for a minute. And so although distancing, masking, and hand washing are critical, that really came out of the thinking that this was a droplet spread virus, and we've learned that it is an aerosol generated spread virus, which we'll get to in a minute, making the air that we breathe critically important. Next slide. So COVID is not just another influenza. As you can see in this slide, the lines are the respiratory illnesses, influenza-like illnesses that we've seen from year to year. The red triangles at the bottom are this last year during the pandemic. You can see that hand washing, hygiene, physical separating, and mostly masking has virtually eliminated all of the other respiratory viruses that we normally see through the year. The green map of the United States in the background is influenza across the country. So the techniques that we have used for COVID were remarkably successful in suppressing the rhinovirus's influenza, parainfluenza, respiratory syncytial virus, and yet we have seen an outbreak all over of COVID. So COVID is far more transmissible than the other normal respiratory viruses, and it is far more serious in terms of the death rate. Next slide. Here in San Diego County, you can see the infection rate is in the red. It's actually a little bit lower than that right now, and I'll explain why in another slide. If the infection rate is 1.0, then one person spreads the virus to one other person. If it's below 1, it dies out because we spread it to fewer and fewer people. If it is above 1, we spread it to more and more people. And so the higher the infection rate, the more the virus incidence grows and the worse the situation becomes. Next slide. And so the Delta variant is the reason why the transmission rate is going up so much. You saw in the previous slide that it was the overall was about 1.5. Here you can see that the Delta variant is 6, so spreading instead of to 1.5, which is an average of all of the virus out there, the Delta virus itself spreads astronomically more. It's logarithmically greater. Next slide. So daily new cases are on the rise, significantly so. And in the red zone, we're not yet in the extreme, but it's clearly trending in the wrong direction. And as you can see in this slide, the positive test rate is 8%. The reason that that's important is if it's over 3%, then we aren't doing sufficient testing to track all of the new cases. And so we will undercount both the infection rate and the daily new cases. So this implies that we're not doing enough testing in order to really track what's going on in San Diego County. But what we are tracking from our testing is a significant rise. So we are in a bad phase right now. Next slide. There was the reason that we got the science wrong into early 2020 and thought that this was an aerosol and therefore recommended wiping and washing and hand washing and physical separating because aerosol is heavier. And if you cough or sneeze in aerosol, as you can see in the bottom of the 3 black graphs on the right, the larger particles fall to the ground quicker, and we thought that live virus would therefore be on contacts and surfaces and spread. What we've realized since then that this is spread more like measles and chickenpox. It's an aerosol, and it is spread more like the top of the 3 graphs. When we cough or sneeze, we spread the virus through the air, and so breathing is really much more important than contact in terms of the spread of this virus, and that is now reflected on both the CDC and the WHO websites. Next slide. The best picture I've seen of this is on the left side of this slide. if I am the person with the virus and I cough or sneeze, someone in the near field close to me is exposed to the virus. Someone who is farther away may or may not be, depending on how the virus hovers in the room. So Randy will talk about this more when he discusses it from an engineering perspective. But depending on where the air handling system is putting the air and where the return duct is, we may actually blow my sneeze or cough to you before it gets to the return air duct. As you can see in this graph, the supply air is coming out above me, the return air is or behind, above the infected person, the return air is behind them, and so the virus goes to the recipient before it gets to the return air duct. We then have to separate our conversation into what I call hardware. I'm sure Randy won't like that word, but the air ducts, the HVAC system, the filtering, all of the mechanicals that we think of so often, and the room space itself as a separate zone, because the virus can get to you before it gets to the filter in the HVAC system. So we really need to manage both. Counterintuitively, we see a number of schools that put MERV 13 filters in their air ducts. That allows for better filtering in the hardware, but because it's harder to push air through a MERV 13 filter, we reduce the air turnover rate in the room itself. We allow the virus to hover longer in the room, and we allow people in the room to become more exposed. So there is no one fix to this problem. As Randy will talk about in a minute, this is a multiple fix problem that we really need to work with. We can put in side stream filters, which this picture shows, a portable air cleaner, and depending where it's located in the room, it may or may not protect us from the air that we breathe. And so not only is a portable air cleaner valuable in some circumstances, but where we put it becomes a critical piece of the conversation. Next slide. So in the end, we need what we call the Swiss cheese, or the multiple barrier strategy. There is no one strategy that will protect us. Clearly, the far right, vaccines, is the most valuable at this point. But there are a number of things that we have to do, from masking, physical distancing, optimizing our ventilation with outdoor air and filtration, quarantining and isolating people who are infected. And so it's a multiple intervention or a multiple barrier strategy that we really need to employ to protect this. And with that, I'll turn the conversation over to Randy.
All right, thanks, Scott. So Scott's kind of laid out the medical reasons behind it, and I'm really trying to teach him the engineering terms. But so we've started the surveys, as we mentioned, in doing the HVAC assessments. But I would just want to do a recap of just the types of systems. I've done many building types and HVAC systems over my plus 25-year career. And this is just a sample of photos of what systems you start to see in some of these buildings, especially in the K-12 buildings. And each building is different. Every HVAC system is different, unless you get to the portable classrooms that are built all the same with the same HVAC unit. There's just many different types. So you can see steam or hot water systems that sometimes even have no outside air to the space. We talked about the portable trailer systems. Then there's HVAC systems that use displacement ventilation. We've seen demand control ventilation used with VRF systems, with variable refrigerant systems. And then you tie in the energy recovery and heat recovery. So just in terms of when you start looking at buildings, it's very important not to treat and provide a solution that one size fits all. That doesn't work. And in fact, it actually causes more harm than good, which I'll explain in a minute. Next slide. So just some of the possible ventilation issues, just the filtration levels, and Dr. Altman mentioned this briefly. So we've seen schools with multiple filter systems. I've seen up to 3 MERV 13 filters in one HVAC system. So obviously, you know how that affects motor horsepower and just the total air changes per hour. But you can't just, I've seen just starting putting in MERV 13 filters because that's recommended by ASHRAE. Can't always do that. Sometimes you see motor burnouts because of the higher static required. So there really needs to be some type of engineering calculation done on motor horsepower and static pressure losses to determine if the existing system can even handle a higher MERV rating filter. Talk about total airflow in the space, just the number of air changes in an hour. And then look at airflow in the breathing zone. That's always critical, and we always look at that when we look at doing on-site assessments. Look at where the supply is located, look at where the return is located. If it's a variable air volume system, does it slow down too much and you're just bypassing the breathing zone by that separation? And then the last one I mentioned on this slide is just the contaminants in the air. So we actually have air quality meters. I actually have one in my office sitting right here that I'm downloading information off of from last week. So I want to mention a couple of these. CO2 is good for measuring amount of outside air that's getting to a space. And we've been using CO2 metering for probably 20, 25 years. But I really want to talk about the next couple is particulate counts. And Dr. Altman showed that graph of that sneeze a few slides back. And the size of the particle count, which is critical when you're dealing with viruses. The COVID virus is in the 0.3 to 1.0 micron range. So when you get to that smaller particle, that smaller particle is probably going to travel further, going to be held up and buoyant in the air, and is going to have to be captured somehow in order to reduce that. And through our assessments and through our air quality testing, it's very apparent that we're not doing a good job across the country of collecting and eliminating or reducing those small particles in the airstream. We're catching the larger ones in the filters, but you really need to get to a MERV 13 before we even start collecting the 0.3 micron ranges. And from the testing, we've seen very, very high numbers. A portion of it's due to higher concentrations of smaller particles outside, but we don't want to bring those inside the classroom. So that's some of the testing that we really concentrate on when we're doing those evaluations. So we'll flip to the next slide, and that's kind of what we're looking for. So these are actually some photos of actual classrooms of outside air intakes. You can see the outside air screen is pretty much plugged or gone, so you can see right to the filters. Which leads to a problem. And some systems only have one set of filters. The other thing is actually the filter racks are, especially on older equipment, aren't set up for eliminating airflow around them. So you slide in the filters and essentially there's an airspace between the filters that's not sealed off. And we found that on several buildings already. So as part of that evaluation, we're looking at things like this on every single air handling unit that's bringing in outside air into the building. And then from there, we build this ventilation management matrix, which actually is a chart that provides all the information, the model number of the unit, how old it is, how many filters, what's the condition of the filters, the size of the filters. And then we start looking at the recommendations. And the 3 main recommendations that we've been doing, which are different for every building, but increased ventilation, increased filtration, and then looking at air cleaning technologies. So those are the types of things we want to, when we're doing the assessment, is to pay really close attention to. Next slide. So just some of the methods to improve the indoor air quality. So there's a lot of new technology, air quality technology, and you've probably been approached by many different vendors selling ionization or UV lights or some type of chemical spraying or atomization. And we have used some of these. We've tested a lot of them in our offices and done air quality testing. So just before people spend a lot of money on these systems, I would caution, make sure you do that HVAC assessment first before you proceed with some of those systems. We've been to a lot of buildings that the systems are installed, but they're not installed correctly. Ionization needs air movement across the little across electrons before they actually work. So those are the types of things that we look for: is a system operating, and is what's being used operating effectively. So just in summary, so the approaches for the building is looking at the building use, the HVAC system, the airflow distribution, and then it's very important to look at the occupant density and activity. What is a space being used for? Is it used for heavy, gyms or musical rooms or practice musical rooms? Those are the types of spaces, cafeterias, large assembly areas where you get a lot of people together. Those are the important ones to really concentrate on. Next slide. So, and this ties into what Dr. Altman was talking about at the beginning of his slides, is just looking at that airflow distribution. Is the HVAC system set up correctly where you can actually move that air across the room and to the return grill or exhaust grill and get fresh ventilation air to everyone without contaminating everyone. So the bottom left is one of the smoke tests we've done on one of the classrooms we've been to, and just looking at the airflow distribution. So you can see the smoke from the ventilation system is coming out of the diffuser, and it's essentially hanging at the 4 or 5 foot level, probably right above the children that are sitting in the desk. So they're really not getting any air changes. So we're trying to solve that through looking at better airflow distribution inside the classroom. And then the bottom right is look at all the small particles coming into essentially an open air intake. That essentially is dust. Those are the particles, and those are the particles that are probably in the 2 to 3 micron range where you can start to see them, because the viruses, obviously you can't see. They're much smaller than that. But if you have that many large particles coming in, you're going to have a lot of smaller ones coming in as well. So we're really trying to filter out essentially everything in that range. Next slide. So there's a lot of air monitoring devices out there. There's portable units, which we use. There's some newer technology that actually is saying that they detect COVID. Very expensive. Talked to one of those vendors a couple of weeks ago, $15,000 per classroom to do actual COVID detection. And it's $750 just for the module, and that module needs to be replaced every quarter. So we're not recommending some of those systems. I don't think we actually have to measure COVID or detect COVID in classrooms. What we need to do is actually fix and improve our indoor air quality in those spaces instead. But there are important things that we look for and that we can measure, and you can do some real-time monitoring if you're interested in some of that. We can discuss that later. Next slide.
Thank you, Randy. Can you hear me again?
We can.
Okay, super. Randy and Dr. Altman, thank you. Before we go to the Q&A panel, we do want to take a couple of minutes to talk about Assembly Bill 841 and the opportunity that San Diego Gas and Electric in San Diego County is making available for the schools to do building assessments, to improve their filtration, and to work on CO2 monitoring, and then also have some additional contingency funds. But the background on AB 841 is it has both a plumbing and a ventilation portion. The plumbing portion we're not really going to cover today, but it's good to know that inefficient toilets and urinals and shower heads, dishwashers, things of this nature are eligible. And certainly we can get folks some more information on that. But the first priority funds are for the underserved areas that meet just one of the 4 key underserved or lower income populations or communities. And registration is currently open. They're expecting the actual applications to go live around August 25th for AB 841 plumbing, and the ventilation program about a month later in September, give or take a few days. But they do a really good job of communicating the people that are administering the program, the California Energy Commission. So we're getting information and in touch with them quite regularly, once or twice a week. And if you had work done between now and going back to August 2020, you can be reimbursed for that as well. And once again, the priority funds being some of the underserved or lower advantaged communities. The details of AB 841 and how to apply is, the first step is to get your district registered, and just about everybody's already done that, although we've been talking with people in the last couple of weeks that had not or weren't exactly sure. They do have a good Zoom video on the California Energy Commission AB 841 website. The other acronym for the program is CALSHAPE, CALSHAPE. And, you know, like for instance, we're doing one of the pilots down at San Ysidro. They have 7 or 8 facilities, but only 5 or 6 qualify as that are on the underserved status list. So a couple of their facilities, they need, would use some other funding potentially for assessments, and 5 or 6 of them do qualify for the AB 841. And there's many other districts like that where it's important to know immediately which one of your schools qualify on that first priority funding list. So the next step then is we're working with folks to help build out the AB 841 worksheet estimates. And it's important to know that you're committing to doing all these things to apply for the money and receive the funding. So you have a funding element for your air handling units and the basic assessment report, which is $10,000 for the base assessment and then $1,000 for each air handling unit. So that's very comfortable for elementary, middle schools, and high schools. They'll provide you $75 for a filtration upgrade for whatever you need for all of your air handling units. And then they'll give you $600 to buy, install, and if you can squeeze some initial upkeep out of that, $600 for each CO2 monitor. Important to know that that is just for classrooms. So your theaters and libraries and cafeterias wouldn't be included in that, but the way the bill was written, it is the CO2 monitors are only for the classrooms. And then the important piece that some people were asking a lot of questions about, it weren't certain, is that there's a 20% contingency fund. So once you subtotal your grant application, or your estimate, I should say, there's 20% contingency funds that you can use for emergency repairs, emergency adjustments, some potential recommissioning work that might need to be done. And then lastly, when the applications go live, there's a bundling process, and we're going to get some more exact logistics and the mechanics of that, but you can put 3 schools in at a time for your online application. So for instance, a larger elementary district that might have 24 schools would file 8 applications, 3 schools at a time, because you build an estimate out, you build the worksheet out for each school in your district. And because San Diego Gas and Electric, and I don't profess to know all the calculations and how the money is apportioned, but there's a lot of funding for San Diego County schools, fortunately, for everyone in this meeting and in Bob's group and Liz's group, everyone that's participating, that there is the possibility of a second phase. And then just this week, from our folks at CASH and a couple of other organizations, looks like there might be some money. They're seriously considering another $200 million to replace aging gas devices, HVAC devices, and replace those with electric devices. And we'll have more on that in the coming days. So a little bit on the AB 841, and of course, like Bob said, if you have specific questions, please put them in the chat box, and we'll get to the Q&A panel here in just a little bit after we wrap up. Dr. Altman is going to begin kind of the call to action as it refers to medical management.
So once we talk about the theory and the systems, we want to talk about what is it that you really can do and need to do moving forward. And the first step, of course, is convincing your key constituents of the importance of managing the airspace and the air quality. Your school boards, administrators, teachers, teaching unions, parents, students, and of course the public and the press. The health and safety concerns, the risk of COVID, the risk of indoor volatile organic compounds and CO2 particulates that we breathe on a daily basis, poor air quality, molds, mildews, humidity, poor temperature control. These are all issues that are addressed simultaneously when we look at the COVID and the monies that we're getting to improve our air handling systems. The hardware and operations concerns, if we can adjust for a lack of laminar airflow and inadequate turnover rates to improve the air movement within the room, if we can repair and upgrade old equipment that is unreliable or unrepairable, if we can tune up equipment that has just been poorly maintained or needs repair, and if we can train our staff to operate and maintain the equipment moving forward in a more refined way. And then lastly, lack of protocols or oversights for the system. We want to provide clear written guidance to the people who are taking care of the systems on how to do it, when to do it, and what to do if there are problems or questions. So the step one is really just convincing ourselves that this is something we need to do.
So then the next part of that is the HVAC assessment. So Scott said, make sure that your the district is educated, but then and this is coming right from ASHRAE, is doing this engineering assessment of every single facility. And so really starting with what we proposed and what we started to do last week for the 4 buildings in the pilot program is looking at exhaust and outside airflows for every single building structure. And sometimes there's multiple buildings on every site. So we're looking at multiple buildings on every site, but it's creating that ventilation management matrix. But I really wanted to concentrate on this slide is to talk about the evaluation of how do we propose the recommendations. And we really break it down into 3 separate steps. The one is the immediate things that can be done, whether it's putting in new filters or putting in some filter system immediately. So anything that we can do, whether it's adjusting the run times that really don't cost any first cost. And then the second thing category we put in is there's some things that may cost some things like CO2 monitoring in spaces, things like that. And then the last one is the more major capital improvements that still may be funded with the $841, but it's replacing aging equipment that just isn't capable of improving or putting in new air handlers to make sure that we have the outside air going to each one of these spaces. So it's really a comprehensive assessment, looking at everything and looking at building drawings. We spent a lot of time looking at existing building drawings to look for improvements that could be made to really start that process of proposing those recommendations that could be implemented. Dr. Altman, will you take this one?
No, I'll just real quickly here, Randy. Thank you. It's Richard again. The second part, of the assessment, I think is important that we have found in working with the folks all over California due to our relationship with the California School Board Association, as well as San Diego County now, is to understand what are the correct protocols and procedures that folks need to maintain these systems. And I think, as we've gotten into the COVID world, our monitoring, our daily upkeep, our daily use of fail-safe procedures, if you will, have changed dramatically. And so we know that maintenance and technician personnel require some additional tools. So one of the things when we do the AB 841 assessments or any of the kind of assessment work that we're going to be doing is to really understand the maintenance team's skill requirements, what is the current skill inventory that they have, and then what are some of the tools that we can provide them to improve that, especially as it relates to daily routines to look at abnormal or normal conditions, month-to-month routines for preventative maintenance, PM schedules, and NPM procedures and protocols. So spending some time on that, I think, is important. And before we go to the Q&A section, I think the other thing, and Dr. Altman and Liz and her team and I, we talked yesterday, this is really one of the bonuses. I mean, we want to use the ESSER funds or AB 841 funds to do the initial assessment work and perhaps some of the initial COVID mitigation activities and or actions, but it's really important to understand that what we're talking about here is really improving the learning environment. Whether it's the student and teacher absences, which ends, a definite dollar return on investment for our districts, the medical and health insurance claims and workman's comp, those are all costs that we have that we can lower by paying closer attention to our indoor air, and the equipment that's interacting with outdoor air is one of the challenges we have, of course, in Southern California, California in general, and any high population cities. The outdoor air is a challenge for the equipment, but in the end, the assessment will help us with that. And of course, we know because of the studies at MIT and Harvard that academic achievement scores will go up when people have a better learning environment. So that's what we had. We're right at about 36 minutes or so, 35 minutes. We had a couple of questions that came in ahead of time. We had one from a superintendent that was sent in ahead of time, and also from a chief business officer. So we want to be sure that we get to those. I know, Bob, you're handling the chat room and looking. I think we'll do this first one. And I think for Randy, if you wouldn't mind answering first, people have asked, what kind of resources are needed for the typical AB 841 site assessment, and how long will it take to get a report? And what might that report look like? I know you started to talk about the table 1, table 2, table 3 recommendations, but Randy, if you want to take that first, and I think Liz will follow.
Yep, I will. So the answer to number one, part one, is we don't need a lot of school resources when we come out to a site. We carry all of our air testing equipment. The two things that we need probably is access to every single classroom and building, and probably a ladder and some access to the plan room. So almost every district has a plan room that we dig through the plans to see what age of the equipment is and things like that. So we try and limit our time needed with actual school facilities people or leadership to a minimum, because we know that everyone is busy. So when you'll get your final report, typically we do assessments 1 week. We'll start putting together the preliminary findings, start putting together some recommendations, which we'll have some for the pilot program next week. And then the report usually follows in 2 to 3 weeks. So the whole process is 5 to 7 weeks, kind of depending on the timing of the site visits and assessments and then the follow-up. So yes, and then the part 4 of that, you can see the report before it goes to the board. We send draft reports to the superintendents and the facility people and make sure that we've caught everything through the assessment. So you will get a chance to review that before it becomes a final report that we sign.
Thank you, Randy. Liz, did you have anything as far as feedback on that?
Absolutely. So just so for those of you who don't know us, we are a super small school district, and just piggybacking on what Randy said, I think I met with Richard for about an hour, but that's because I was really curious about our air conditioning systems and our HVAC, because I don't know personally as a superintendent. I came from the teaching end of things, and then literally turned it over to where our plans are, and they took over, and I didn't have to do anything. My chief business officer has worked with Richard a couple of times just to make sure all our ducks are in a row. But literally, it's pretty hands-off for a school or a school district. So I just wanted to encourage you guys to do it and know that it's not going to take a ton of time, especially right now as we're getting ready for school. I know everyone's feeling really stressed about that. And if any of your superintendents or principals want more information, please have them reach out to me, and I'll put my email address in the chat box because I'm more than willing to talk to anybody.
And just one other quick comment. If a school district has someone that's really wants to understand more about what we do, we welcome them to tag along. We would like to educate, if there's facility guys that really want to learn more about their system and what we're looking for. Absolutely. If they have the time to do it, a couple school districts did that. They actually went with us everywhere, and we welcome that. We want to educate them as well.
Thank you, Randy and Liz. The other question that came in from a CBO, and it was a really good question, actually, and so we built a slide for it, was the question was really more about, look, when we take a look at the AB 841 and you're trying to meet all the CUPCA requirements and get board resolutions and things like this to use government funds and use them with good responsibility, what does that timeline look like? So what we did is we built out something so you could kind of see, and Randy mentioned 5, 6, 7 weeks, and that's accurate. This one goes more like 7, 8, or 9 because it had some board approval time at the front end. But basically, if you started at a week 0 and you said, hey, look, we would like to learn more about this, well, then you can really put together some estimates pretty quickly, regardless of the size of the district, in a week or so, and then also get some estimated costing for what does the true assessment look like. And then we've helped some of the boards present. We helped Liz with her board as well, and have a few different situations like that. And so there's specific resolutions and messaging depending on the makeup of your board and how they like to work. And so it's all different, but certainly that can be done in the second week. And about the third week, you would kind of think about, well, we're going to be ready for a board meeting. And, some boards meet twice a month, some meet once a month. I know it's all different, and a lot of different emergency meetings with COVID things going on right now, unfortunately, and it's been time consuming for everybody. But certainly in the first 3-4 weeks, you can be ready and get approval from a board to go down this pathway and agree to use the AB 841 funding and or tap into some of your additional ESSER funding, or perhaps some people have mentioned they've got some bond funding for some of this as well. And then you kind of get to, like Randy said, there's a week or two, depending how big a district is, but a few days on site, depending how many buildings, could lead into a couple of weeks. But so I put in a couple of weeks for that. And then you get to, like I said, around September 25th with the AB 841 ventilation actual live application. So that allows us to get those in and comfortably. And then after that, we would begin to draft, some initial site findings and review those with the district and their facilities folks, getting to the final report. So just thought it would be helpful because the one CBO had emailed us in and asked a particular question on that. We have another one about outbreaks, but before we do another question, I think, Bob, you have some things from the chat or someone that might have raised their hand. So I'll just stay right here before we go to question 3.
Sure. So are there any tips you can give folks that they could do immediately in terms of improving indoor air quality? And can you discuss a little bit portable air cleaners and their benefits and pitfalls?
Let me start with the second one, with the portable air cleaners first, and then I'll come back to the first question. So the portable air systems, we actually have them in all of our offices because we have a heat pump system that's not capable of doing much more than a MERV 7 filter. So we're actually did a lot of testing with different manufacturers with portable filter units. So the issue that we've found is we're adding a lot more equipment that's operating that in 5 years, that just in 1 year, we're going to be replacing filters 3 or 4 times in those HEPA filter systems. And then just the ongoing maintenance of those systems and what is the longevity of those HEPA fan filter units. So we would rather, as part of doing the HVAC assessments, we're looking for ways that we can improve the central air handling systems instead of adding more equipment that needs more maintenance, that needs more filter changes. So yes, HEPA fan filter units can do a certain job. As Dr. Altman said in one of his slides, it's important where they're placed. So that's actually also part of an assessment. If we recommend them, being placed in a certain area. So it cleans that air before it actually goes through the room. So there's a few things that, because I know a lot of states and districts are just mandating put one in every classroom, and the number of units that are going to be put in classrooms and the first initial cost is going to be enormous if that happens in every single school district. which we don't recommend. Back to the first question, I want to make sure I catch all of it, Bob. Can you just repeat the question?
Do you have any tips that people can implement right away? Some do now and immediate benefit kinds of things.
Yep, and that comes as part of the report in the study that we do. The thing is, if a district wants to do something, I would recommend doing the HVAC assessment as doing something, because I've seen a lot of districts spend money that is just not being used wisely. So the first step, and it's actually an ASHRAE recommendation, is to do the HVAC assessment to make sure what's being implemented is going to work and going to work long term. Because this money, is going to be spent once, it's going to be available once, and we just don't want to recommend something that's going to need a lot of maintenance. A lot of people are doing UV lights. Well, UV lights last about a year or two, and they need to be replaced. And the expense of replacing those lights, I've had districts go 5-6 years without replacing the lights because they don't have any funding for it. So those are the types of things to really investigate, and we do that as part of the assessment.
Bob, it's Richard. I'll just take on to that for a quick second. I think another thing, then we talked about this on a couple of the education sessions we've been involved in. One of the things that people can also do immediately, sit down with your maintenance and facilities folks and really understand what are their major concerns, what are their day-to-day challenges, what have they been able to do immediately, and what are they really lacking, right? Without a good inventory and a good understanding of what the problem is. And I know that Dr. Altman and I had a couple of conversations with some other districts just this week, and that's where kind of some of the pre-planned questions, if you will, that we had going into the conversation, was to try and have a deeper understanding of what are they hearing from the teachers, what are they hearing from the maintenance folks, because maybe they, in the midst of a pandemic, they didn't really have time to do that. So I think sitting down with your maintenance folks, but Dr. Altman may have a follow-up on that also.
Yeah, I concur with both. I think the first thing to do is to not panic and react, but to kind of think through what you want to do. Meeting with your current staff, seeing, do they keep a log? Do they know which furnaces have been repaired at what or assessed at what time? Have they replaced the filters? Do they have a written log of what they have been doing and what needs to be done? If there isn't one, then immediately we need to go into an assessment and do an active inventory. If they have one, then they'll know where the problems exist and what things need to be addressed. The problem with overreacting, if we put in a MERV 13 filter, we can blow out the motor. If it's not designed for it, we can reduce the air turnover rate in the room and actually be counterproductive. If we open outdoor air ports that don't have filters and we're bringing in outdoor pollutants, that may not be the ideal thing. So we want to be careful about our reactions and make sure that whatever it's done, it fits in the Swiss cheese model and it becomes a help and not a hindrance. So it's really important to sit back and do this in a thoughtful way.
Thank you. So if a school district or a school works with you on assessment, I guess the straightforward way to say this is, are you going to try and sell them something else?
Yeah, that's a good question. In our LifeWings and KFI together, we are doing the assessment. We're helping with the 841. We are not equipment vendors, so we don't sell equipment. We're not a contractor. We're not installing it. We will help you decide which way is the best path forward. And then if there's design services, that's a separate thing, but we are not pushing that at all.
And do you provide assistance with the 841 grant application process? What would that look like?
Right, Richard, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Randy. So yeah, on the 841, we'll help with that. Matter of fact, it's allowed to have your consultant or advisor, contractor, whoever, to be able to log in and help with the evaluation process and monitor that, make adjustments, or change requests. So we're already set up and registered for some of the schools we're working with as a helping be a co-registrant in their system. So, I think the most important thing is to get a handle on what those worksheet estimates really are for your buildings. I mean, that's the key, because that is going to tell you what kind of funding you can apply for, and the day is coming, relatively quickly now. So, and I think the other part of that is, as Liz alluded to, when we talked about this, is that some districts don't have a lot of extra resources, and so that's really important. Larger districts may have done their estimates long ago, because they were dialed into this. So it's not a one size fits all, and it's important to know where you can get resources and some assistance, and how do you get registered, and then more importantly, run those estimates so that you're getting a good idea of what kind of funding that you would be qualified for, especially when you're on the first priority list, as many are that we're working with.
Awesome. Well, we're at 10:53. We said it would be a 50-minute presentation, and we answered the questions that were submitted. So if you have additional questions, I'm willing to hang out for a little while. You can continue to put them in the chat. We can follow up afterwards with any questions, respond in writing. I've also put my email in. If you want to email in questions, we can include them in the follow-up that we send out. I will send the slide deck out to everyone who registered for this webinar this afternoon. The recording that I'm making, unfortunately, will take a lot longer than that. We have to transcribe it and then add closed captions before we can publish it. So that could take up to 2 weeks, but we can get the slide deck out to you right away. Richard, can you give a brief overview on what to expect in the next week's webinar?
Thank you, Bob. Yeah, so for next week, we're going to share with you the results, typical results of what we found on some of the assessments that we've done already. Share with you typical initial findings, and then really, as Randy mentioned earlier, break the recommendations down into the table 1 recommendations, some examples of things that sites can be fixing on their own, within a matter of hours of receiving the report. Table 2 recommendations that would involve a little bit more thoughtful response. Perhaps some districts can do it all themselves. Others might need some assistance with some building automation or some technical skills that they may not have in-house. And then some examples of more significant capital expenditure. And then also, Dr. Altman will share with us, how do we tie in the overall goals and objectives for the district with the county public health goals and objectives, the school district school nurse and the school wellness and health officers, their overall objectives. We talk often with Dr. Malone about vaccines, ventilation, and testing, and how does all of that kind of tie together with the overall health and wellness strategy for a particular district. That'll be part of a typical report, so we'll have a little bit about that. And then also, we mentioned earlier that we talk about ongoing the ability to understand what are some of the maintenance skills and some of the ideas for the future. We'll share a little bit about that. Ron McGuire will be with us also. So we're really looking forward to next week.
Fantastic. Was one last question. Can you work in counties outside of San Diego?
Absolutely, and of course, we focused today's presentation on that. That's how we initially met a lot of folks, was through the California School Board Association and some of the public series of webinars we're doing with them. Orange County, obviously, there's some San Diego Gas and Electric partners up there, but of course, AB 841 we can do in any of the counties of the state, any of the utilities that have paid into the fund. We're very familiar with all the different sectors and the different priority schools and priority school districts in all the counties in the state. So we are working in many, many counties currently, but thank you for asking that.
Fantastic. Richard, Liz, Randy, Scott, thank you very much for the presentation. Friends, I've been saying for months on the telebriefing that there is no one size fits all solution when it comes to ventilation. There are some strategies, but you really need to have an assessment performed to understand the needs and gaps that are present in each of these settings. I hope this webinar helped illustrate why that's true. I hope you'll join us for our next webinar. We'll follow up later this afternoon to make sure that you've got the slide deck and links for the next time in. Also answer any questions that come in. Thanks. Take care, everyone.